Yves Giroux, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Your latest report is about housing, which everyone seems to be talking about right now, and says that Canada will need to build 1.3 million new homes to close the gap between supply and demand. Do you think that's possible? Were you able to measure that?
Well, we were not able to measure Canada's capacity to build that many houses. But one thing that is sure is that that would be in addition to the 1.8 million houses or housing units that are expected to be built between now and 2030. And that is already quite an ambitious target. So to add 1.3 million housing units to the already ambitious 1.8 million is going to be very, very, not necessarily difficult, and certainly not impossible, but it will require a lot of efforts across all regions in the country.
We've heard, and I'm sure you've been watching closely, all these announcements over the past couple of weeks on housing, all kinds of housing, from homes to rental apartments to affordable housing. Will you be now doing a new analysis based on those measures to get an idea about whether that's going to close the gap? And what have you made of what you've heard in terms of your report and versus what you've been hearing on the announcements?
So the one thing that will be important for us to do an upcoming or a new analysis will be the details of these announcements. And as we are speaking, there's not that much detail. So we'll be waiting for the budget to see if there are more details. And post-budget, there's often additional details that become available. And depending on whether there is interest by parliamentarians for my office to do a further deep down analysis on whether these programs will be sufficient to close, at least in part, that gap, we may do a more in-depth analysis of the housing file. We've done that in the past, looking at the various programs of CMHC and the federal government, and to see how much how many using units were being built and how much these programs were effective, but that was a few years ago.
I want to ask you a little bit about some questions ahead of the budget to get your sense about what you're going to be watching for. You have said previously that you expect we will return to the Bank of Canada's target of inflation of 2%, I think by the end of the year. Do you have any concerns based on what you've seen from the government's spending plans, budgetary measures before the budget, that progress on reducing inflation could be slowed, that the spending could in some way contribute to it?
Well, government spending, both federally and provincially, is inflationary when it increases. That's something that goes without saying. There are some people who say, well, some types of spending is investment, and its objective is to lower the long-term inflation by increasing the productive capacity of the economy, which is true in many cases. But in the short term, whether you're building road, houses, or you're just sending checks to people, you need resources. You need people to build these roads or houses. You need materials to build houses and roads, for example. So it creates pressure on prices in the economy. So when you have a provincial or federal and provincial governments spending a little bit more or a lot more depending on the cases, it does add pressure to inflation in the short term at least.
So when you hear Minister Freeland say that the deficit is not going to grow in the upcoming budget, that leads me obviously to believe that there's going to be some new revenue measures, perhaps even a tax on the wealthy is one of the things that's been floated out there. What will you be looking for in terms of that stream of potential new revenue for the federal government?
Well, we'll be looking at how these new announcements have been financed or will be financed because, as you mentioned, the minister has indicated that she plans on having a deficit that will go no higher than $40 billion in the current fiscal year. And there's also a commitment to have the deficit as a share of the GDP be no higher than 1% of GDP by 26-27. And with the announcements we've heard recently, it leaves very little room to do that without increasing taxes or reducing spending in other areas, which is another possibility in addition to tax revenues. And these are the kinds of things I'll be watching for in the budget.
Let me ask you, if I can, about interest rates, because the Bank of Canada held its interest rate at 5% this week. I think some people were starting to think it might start to, go down already. That hasn't happened. There's a suggestion it could happen in June. What is your expectation now on interest rates in terms of when a cut will come and how quickly it could come?
When we released our economic and fiscal outlook in March, we believed that economic conditions were sufficient to allow the bank to start reducing its interest rate in April. It didn't happen for various reasons. So the bank may have a slightly different reading of the economy than we have. But we also indicated in our March economic and fiscal outlook that delaying the decrease in interest rates from April to June would not materially affect the economic growth for this year or next. So I'm expecting that the economic conditions will warrant a reduction in the bank rate at the next policy committee meeting or the following one. So it's just a matter of a few weeks until we start seeing a decrease in the rate of the Bank of Canada.
What is your overall concern right now about the economy, or do you feel okay with where we are or not?
Well, there's many concerns, of course. So we are in a period of relatively slow economic growth, and we're seeing the impact it has on unemployment, which is edging up. And we are relying to a significant extent on growth, stronger than expected growth in the U.S. So I'm concerned that with weak growth in Canada, a slowdown in the U.S. could push us back into even further economic slowdown, stagnation, or even a very small negative growth, a very short period of negative growth. And there's always the high level of debt of households. Sure. So there are a couple of factors that are risk factors for the Canadian economy.
Okay, Yves Giroux, so glad of you to make the time. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.